Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I have a chilling collection of ghost stories for you to indulge in, so get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My dad has been dead for over 20 years. He was a heavy smoker. I don't smoke. About 10 years ago, I was driving home along a village road that came to a T-junction on a blind bend, and while I was usually really careful, that day I had a lot on my mind and wasn't really concentrating. I suddenly realized that I was approaching the junction far too fast, and I put my foot on the brake to find the pedal was already halfway down, and at that same moment the car was filled with the smell of cigarette smoke. I was able to stop safely, and as I did so I heard a voice in my head say, "Now concentrate, you daft bat," which is exactly the sort of thing he would have said. Thanks, Dad. I still miss you. Back in 2011, I was living in a house in El Paso, Texas for a year with my 2 sons. It was a nice place with a huge backyard for our dogs, 3 bedrooms, 2 dens, and a 2-car garage. It was a great place for the price. Also, the landlord lived almost across the street, so he was always nearby if needed. Shortly after moving in, I was in my bedroom watching TV and unwinding from a long day. At the time, I was unemployed and had received a severance check from my ex-employer and was living off that while I was job hunting. My bedroom was right across the hall from my youngest son's bedroom, and my older son had his bedroom next door to mine as he was disabled, and there were times I would have to get up in the middle of the night if he needed to use the bathroom. Late that night, I heard singing coming through the AC vents and assumed it was my son's girlfriend who had just recently moved in with us and had a great singing voice. I chalked it up to that and told myself that I would speak to my son about it in the morning. But the following morning, when I asked my son about it with his girlfriend present, they told me that they thought the singing was coming from my room. They thought perhaps I was watching something on TV, and so they turned up their volume to block out the song. It was strange. The house was an older one, built in 1959, and built in an L shape, with one side of the L having bedrooms and bathrooms, and the other side having den, dining room, kitchen, and the room that could be used as an office or spare bedroom and ended with a garage. All doors and windows had wrought iron, and it started that when we would leave the house, we would lock the wrought iron door going through the house from the garage, and many times upon our return the door would be unlocked. The same happened when we were in the house. That door would remain unlocked while we were all inside, but many times when I would have to go to the garage, the door would be locked. This house had been renovated. It had new tile, carpet, cabinets in the kitchen and such, but certain rooms had these old-style push-button light switches. They would be lit if the light in the room was off, and then you would push it, and the switch would make a loud, audible double click, and the light would turn on. In the hallway, the guest's bathroom light began turning on at different times of the night, but only while we were awake. We could be watching TV in the den, and you would hear the click, and the light in the bathroom would be on, but no one would be around. We could find no reason for it to be doing this, and I remember shortly after we had moved in, I had a brother over to help me connect all of my devices and connect a new Wi-Fi modem. After he finished with everything, it was dark outside, and he asked where the bathroom was. I told him it was the first door on the left down the hallway. I heard him go in, press the light switch, and then heard him relieve himself as the house wasn't that big. That's when we heard a loud ka-chunk, and my brother screamed out loud, flushed, and came out. We told him we all heard it, and this happened on a regular basis. As we were still settling in the house, I bought a touch-sensitive lamp that I could place on the table next to my son's hospital bed, so that those times he called me late at night, I could just go in, tap the light, and have a light in his room. From off, if you touched the light once, it would be dim, The second would be medium bright, and the third would be the strongest. Of course, the fourth touch would then switch it off. About a week into this, it started to turn on in the middle of the night, but it always seemed to turn on between 12 and 2 a.m, and it was always on the medium setting. There was no way that my disabled son could have been able to reach the light, as it was to the left of his bed and out of range of his hands and arms, as he had very limited range of motion in his arms after his car accident. This light turned on every night without fail. There were several times that I would try and stay awake, just so that I could catch the light turning on and run into the room and catch our invisible culprit. It never worked. I could be sitting up in bed with my door open, watching for the hallway to brighten from the light being turned on. I was never able to catch it. As soon as I would start to doze off and my eyes would close, I would snap awake and the light would already be on. At this time, I downloaded a Ghost Hunters app on my phone to test some things out. That night I was walking around the house trying to get an EMF reading. They were the highest in my son's room. My brother was over again that night and told me that it was probably just picking up the electrical current from the wiring in the walls, so we decided to kill all the power in the house at the main fuse box and check the room again. Even with the power turned off, the EMF readings were highest in the guest bedroom and highest again in my disabled son's room. One night I had my girlfriend staying over, and that night, after we had had our grown-up activities, we opened the door to my room so that if my son called I could hear him. We went to sleep, and I woke up to her screaming that someone was at the door. I looked, and sure enough there was a shadow figure. I jumped out of bed, moved to the left of the door and ran into the hallway. From there I saw the shape go into the bathroom, the same one that kept turning itself on. I turned on the light, and my hands were shaking, preparing to combat whoever was in there. But there was no one. I couldn't get my girlfriend to go back to sleep, and she packed all her stuff and left. The next day I decided to go across the street to speak with my landlord and tell him that we had some spooky happenings. It was then that he told me that he had bought the house after the woman who had lived there had passed on, as she had died within the house, and he bought it and turned it into a rental property, and I was his first tenant within it. After I told him all of these things, he told me he was willing to rent a video camera that we could set up in my son's room. I told him I'd think about it, and that we would just see how things progressed, as no one had been harmed, and whatever was in that house did not seem malevolent in any way. As weeks turned into months, and each night passing meant we waking up in the middle of the night to turn off the light in my son's room, as it would eventually wake me up. The doors around the house would also lock and unlock themselves. The light in the bathroom would turn itself on or off, and we just kind of got used to it. One night when I was asleep in my room, I had the AC on and the ceiling fan in my room, as El Paso summer nights can be hot as hell. I was asleep and was awoken by the sound of the vertical blinds knocking against themselves. I wrote it off as the air being moved by the fan and AC. I closed my eyes and was about to doze off again when I felt the hair on the back of my neck prick up. I closed my eyes tighter and told myself, "Don't look." As soon as I thought that, I felt breathing on my right ear, and as plain as day something whispered, "Mother," into my ear. I yelled and jumped out of bed and turned on my light, but again, there was nothing. As time moved on, I began dating another woman who had 3 kids. When things began to get more serious between us, I converted the room that could be used as an office into a spare bedroom with a set of bunk beds and another small bed for my girlfriend's youngest daughter. As they would come over and began spending weekends with us, they inevitably started experiencing things themselves, mostly shadow figures. The little girl was the one that would see this the most. She'd get scared and come into our room and jump into bed with us. All of us had experiences with the shadow, as we began to call it. There were times where I'd be watching TV in the den and I would feel the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I would spin around only to catch a streak moving away, and in a second it would be gone. There was one morning that I woke up at around 4:30 a.m, hideously early, and the damn light was on in my son's room again. I always tried to catch the light and turn it off before it woke my son, as due to his brain injury, sleep was very important for him to have. As I walked in quietly to switch off the light, I was pissed that this had been going on for so long. I tapped the light twice to turn it off, and started walking out of the room. I stopped at the foot of my son's hospital bed and said out loud, "If there is something here, turn on that light." And almost immediately it did. I didn't realize that my son, who I thought was asleep at the time, woke up. The look of terror on his face shook me to my core. To this day, I still have nightmares about that morning and the look on his face. After that morning, I unplugged that lamp and put it away in the garage. As our 1-year lease was coming to an end, I contacted the El Paso Paranormal Society and asked if they could come and check out the house. I called them and sent them an email via the website but never got an answer. My girlfriend, who I married, but that didn't last, and that's a story for another day, ended up moving and buying a house in the same neighborhood only about 3 blocks away. As we were almost done with our move, I was finally contacted by the El Paso Paranormal Society. They were anxious to come check out the house and wanted to set up an appointment about 2 weeks from the day of their call. I told them we were already moving and that we would not be living there any longer, and by the time they would come, we'd be gone. So the guy I spoke to gave me some advice. He said to make sure that the last thing we said when we left the house for the final time would be to announce to whatever was in it that we were going and it needed to stay there and that they weren't allowed to follow. Him saying it gave me chills. That night, as me and my girlfriend were getting the last things out of the house, we did one final walkthrough, make sure all the lights were off, the doors locked, and the landlord had already been over to inspect and just asked us to leave a light on in the house. We chose to leave the light on in the kitchen, as it had a window with vertical blinds that looked out into the driveway of the house. This way, it would seem as if someone was home. As my wife and I got into each of our own cars and had our own windows down as we were chatting to each other, I remembered what the ghost hunter guy had said and told my wife that I'd be right back. I got out of my car, unlocked and opened the front door, and stood in the doorway and called out, "To whatever's in this house, it's your house now. You're not allowed to follow us, and you must stay here." With that statement said, I backed out of the house, closed and locked the door, and got back into my car. I told my wife it was time to go, and all of a sudden, right in front of us, we saw one of the vertical blinds in the kitchen window move sideways, as if someone was getting a look out. We both got chills, and agreed it was best to get out of there. It was only after I moved out, and having some conversations with some of the neighbors, that I discovered that the woman that lived there previously had not only died in that house, but she stayed in the house undiscovered for a little more than a week. Eventually, the police were called to do a wellness check due to the mail and newspapers that began piling up, and no one answering the door when they would knock. After the police gained access to the house, she was found dead in the hallway between my son's room and the bathroom. You know, the one with the light that would turn on and off at all times? Another interesting fact is that as this lady grew older, she became very angry and hateful. She became paranoid, developed dementia, and she alienated all of her family and even her husband, who eventually moved out and just paid the bills while she lived there alone. When her husband passed away, the lady kept the urn with his ashes on the kitchen table that looked out onto the front driveway. The same window that had the vertical blind pushed sideways as if something or someone was looking out at me and my wife at the time on our last night at the house when we moved out. One of this lady's daughters told her, the neighbor's witness, that when this daughter was a child, that she didn't like to be in that room because a dark smoke came out of the outlet at night. the same outlet that my son had his touch lamp plugged into. This meant there was also something in the house, even while the couple that lived there were both alive, as told to me by this same witness. The house was first built over this subdivision in 1959. I wonder now what it was built over. I genuinely believe ghosts and hauntings are real. I think and believe that because both my son and I had very near calls with death, perhaps it made us more susceptible and open to the entities of the house. Have you ever tried to capture something with your camera or phone that you felt but couldn't see? Later you found out you were right when something showed up in the photo that you couldn't see with your eyes, whether at an event or with a family or friend, without an odd feeling at the time. You later realized that a strange feeling was your intuition, signaling that something was off or unusual. This makes you question all the times you felt that way and wondered if there was something unseen. This is an experience I had when I was 27. In late September of 1996, I stayed with a friend, her baby girl and my baby boy. They were born one day apart in June. She and I had been friends for 8 years, and we had many mutual friends. I'd been to her house many times since high school, which had been her late parents' house and her childhood home. When her mum passed away, shortly after my friend got married, the house went to her and her new husband. They updated it and moved in and had their daughter. Her husband worked for a coal mine. It was pretty far away, and too far of a commute to come back and forth every day. So he got one 3-day weekend off a month, then back to work. So it was just her daughter and her most of the time. She invited me and my son to stay overnight one night, and I happily accepted. I was a single mum, as my son's father passed away. Before he was born, and he never saw him, I lived with my mum and her husband. I was looking forward to a change of scenery, and thought it would be good for mum to have some time with him alone. We had a great time. Both babies were so cute and were both good-natured. She took lots of pictures of us all. We chatted and played with them, fed them, bathed them, and put them to bed. We visited some places, and when she said she was tired and was going to bed, I wanted to wind down for a little bit, so I stayed up a bit longer. After she went to her room, and I checked on my son, I went to the living room and sat on the couch. I sat there alone in the quiet. I had this funny, creepy feeling that I was being watched and got goosebumps. I told myself that I was being silly and that I was tired from lack of regular sleep. I shrugged it off and got up and got ready for bed, and we all slept through the night. The next morning we hung out, and I stayed there until about 4 p.m. It was nice. Before I left, she said she would take the pictures to be developed and would get 2 copies made and would let me know when she got them back. 2 weeks later, she called and said that she had them and if I wanted to come by and get them. She then said that she and her husband were there. Then she said that she wanted to show me something in a few of the pictures and would not elaborate further, just that she and her husband wanted my opinion. I said I would be round shortly. My mum let me leave my son with her, and off I went. When I arrived, I didn't pick up on anything until she opened the envelope from the picture developer. We were looking through them and they were so good. Then before she got to the last picture, she paused and told me there was something in these pictures she couldn't quite figure out. I was curious. She seemed a bit hesitant and then showed me the first of a series of 3 pictures. She had saved them for last. They had been taken one after the other. I was sitting on her couch holding her daughter when she pointed out there was something strange to the left-hand side of us. I looked at the picture and saw what I thought was a slight white blur to the right of us, a little around my shoulder. At first I thought her daughter or I had moved slightly as she was talking, or she had moved while taking the picture. She then showed me the next one. There was something that looked like white transparent smoke or mist, and it was bigger than the first picture. I squinted at it and tried to think about what it could be. We didn't smoke. There were no candles burning, no mist vaporizer. I then watched her pick up the last picture. My eyes widened when I saw what looked like something sitting on the couch beside us. It reminded me of ectoplasm from Ghostbusters. It looked like an apparition was forming. It was a milky white, translucent figure. It looked like it had a head with a skull-like face. It seemed like it was leaning towards us, with an arm and what could have been a hand up to the side of the face, like it was resting its cheek against its hand, curled by the knuckle, and the elbow sitting flat on the table. It was sitting and gazing at us, a head with a shoulder, its arm bent at the elbow, resting its chin on the bald hand. There was a little bit of what looked like its upper torso. It looked like it had tried to form more but stopped at that point. It was facing us. The left side of its face to the camera, its profile slightly turned, showing its right eye socket. I was stunned. Chills covered my body. My mind was trying to register this. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Her husband came into the kitchen to greet me and saw my expression. They both felt the same way. We tried to come up with a plausible and rational explanation, but couldn't. Then I remembered how I felt that night. I told them about it. They were looking at me with looks of wide-eyed incredulity. It showed up on the negatives too. I asked them if they felt that way, and they both said they hadn't. Of course, he wasn't there a lot since they moved in. This was her family home, and she felt safe and comfortable. It did not feel sinister, and it didn't last very long. It wasn't a black mass or figure. It was white. I later found out she showed her older brother the copies of these photos. They had the same reaction. She asked if they ever felt anything watching them or had any strange experience. Her brother, the middle child, said that there was a ghost in the house and that he saw it when he was a kid. I forget what else she found out, if he elaborated more about it, or if it had been evil or negative. I'm not really sure. She was very surprised by this, as she had never experienced anything herself. Of course, she was a bit unnerved. I never had that happen to me before or since. When I was younger, my parents used to host family gatherings around the holidays. It was all sorts of extended family, as well as the immediate family. It wasn't uncommon for people that I had never met to show up. When I was 6 or 7, I remember noticing this guy for the first time. He looked like he was close to my dad's age, which must have made him close to 50. He was pretty short, kind of stocky, and he had these thick framed 50s-style glasses. Even as a kid, I noticed the guy never seemed to engage with anyone. He kind of just ambled around and smiled like he was taking everything in and appreciating the gathering. I remembered being really comforted by this presence. He kept showing up from time to time, but I still don't remember him talking to anyone, though I do have a vague memory of him sitting with my dad and granddad on the couch while the two of them talked, and the guy smiled at me. When I was around 10, we stopped having those sorts of gatherings because of some financial issues. I'd kind of forgotten about the guy until I turned 18 and was getting ready to graduate high school. I asked my dad if he would mind inviting some of the extended family to my graduation, and for some reason I brought up the guy. My dad looked puzzled, and when he asked me who I meant, I gave him a brief description and he turned white. He grabbed a photo album and showed me a picture, and asked me if this was the person I was referring to. Yeah, that's him, I said nonchalantly, and my dad began freaking out. The picture was of my great-grandfather, who died in the mid-60s. I don't know exactly what happened, but my parents and grandparents are convinced I saw his ghost coming to visit to check up on the family. I'm not really a believer in the supernatural, but I don't really have a solid excuse for this story, unless I dreamt it up, which I don't think I did. I used to teach in the evenings in Japan for about 5 years. I often met students at different temples and shrines because people used the rooms there as community spaces for things like that. It was around 11:30 p.m. and I had just had my last English lesson with a student. After she left, it was my job to vacuum the room I had used and turn off all the lights, so I went into the room with the vacuum and there were dozens of decorated drums and portable shrines I had never seen before that were being stored there for the upcoming festival. I opened the door and could see them move a little, but I figured it was the vibrations from me opening the sliding door and went about my business. I usually try not to think about creepy things and just ignore it if something like this happens. I turned out all the lights before bringing back the vacuum, except the last one by the entrance. I then went to the storage room again and put the vacuum back. As I opened the door to the storage room, the big drums started booming in a rhythm super loud, and the portable shrines were all making noises too with the little drums on them. My senses became overwhelmed, and I was afraid to look. I fled from the building and ran to my car, only to remember I hadn't locked up. I didn't want to be fired, so I had to call my husband and was on speakerphone with him the entire time that I ran back to the temple and locked the door with shaking fingers, and I could still hear the drums from outside. Luckily I made it out all right, but I feel like something was messing with me. Since then, people asked me if I saw any ghosts at the temples, because in Japan they believe ghosts at temples come out at night, but I never told them and just said no. I was playing with a stick in the backyard and told myself I could beat the devil's ass with my stick sword. I was 7 at the time. Then, out of a random junk in the backyard, an arm started stretching out and groaning started. It was mumbling something and sounded like the voice of an old person in pain. Since I wasn't a complete idiot by 7-year-old standards, I ran to the house as fast as I could. Turns out the bookshelf was from a yard sale of someone who died. The arm manifesting itself was the same as the bookshelf. My parents, being superstitious Hispanics, took that bookshelf to the dump, not allowing that negative juju into our home. They said a rosary for a week, sprinkled holy water in the backyard, and it never happened again. My parents, knowing I wasn't a liar, thankfully believed me. What happened made no sense, but I'm sure it was tied to the passing of the person. I'm sure if I stayed to see what came out, I probably wouldn't be around today to tell you. I've had a few things happen to me throughout my life. When I was about 12 or 13, I was walking home from a friend's house after school and passed by a girl that appeared to be slightly younger than I was. She was soaking wet and looking seriously upset, so I asked her what was wrong, and she ignored me. I didn't think anything of it. I got home to my father warning me about going near the lakes, because a 10-year-old girl drowned in one the day before. This is the first of many ghosts that have made their presence known to me. When I was 23 and in army barracks, they were haunted as hell. I had the ghost of one girl walk up to me in the middle of the night by opening my door and letting the light in. When I woke up and asked who the hell they were, they screamed and slammed the door. I ran out to catch up with her, because females weren't allowed in the barracks past curfew, and there was no one in the hall. The staff sergeant that was on duty asked me why the hell I was screaming and slamming doors for. So yeah, obviously I had to apologize and close my door and try to sleep again. My wife and I went on a haunted walking tour of Old Town San Juan Capistrano. We enjoyed the spooky stories and history, but never really took the haunted part too seriously. At a stop at one of the old houses, the tour guide explained the history of the house and how she thought of it as her favourite stop. She said she had experienced the former resident Alice, and that she always felt welcome there. She said people have seen shadows cross the room at night, and other times, but never felt threatened. She also said one of her fellow guides liked the house as well, but for the opposite reason. He never felt welcome and always had a disturbing feeling at that part of the tour. As we were standing by the front door, the house is not open to the public, other people, 2 other women on the tour, were asking Alice to show herself and peering around in the windows through the door. My wife looked on with interest while I stood back on the patio and leaned up against the railing. Nothing happened to them or for them, so they left that area and walked around to another side. I stayed for a moment longer, looking inside the house from where I stood. It was then that I felt a very gentle pressure on my chest, not like a hand, but still like a gentle push, accompanied by an overall tingling sensation across my body. I also felt an intense compulsion to leave right away, which I did. As I walked around the corner where the rest of the group was, my wife saw me and must have seen something on my face, even through the darkness. I explained the sensation I felt and the tour guide said, "That's Alice." We talked for a bit and wondered why I and the other male tour guide felt that way when most everyone else felt welcomed. My wife suggested that perhaps Alice didn't like men. About 6 hours later at 3 a.m. or so, when I was in bed, I experienced the first night terror I've had in a long time, and the only sleep paralysis I've ever had. In what felt like a dream, I saw someone coming to the room, an adult-sized shadow move around my wife's side of the bed and lie down. It was at that time the sleep paralysis occurred. I tried to move, tried to talk, but all I could do was produce a gurgling, rapid snoring sound. I was trying to form words, but just made noise. My wife poked me as she often does when I snored, and I was almost able to form a word. It was clear in my head, but I don't know how clear it was to her. What I do know is she woke up and shook me, concerned for my well-being, which broke my sleep paralysis. I apologized, but didn't want to go into any details at the time. She drifted off back to sleep fairly quickly. It took me about 15 to 20 minutes to calm down and go back to sleep. I'm a skeptic, but that was the first time I've ever experienced anything like that. I was a kid, old enough to know that Santa Claus wasn't real, and one Christmas Eve I was staying at my uncle's old farmhouse. In the middle of the night I awoke to the sight of an old man looking exactly like the typical Santa. I was so confused and scared, so I just kept my eyes closed and eventually fell back asleep. I told my family about this mysterious Santa visit, and to my surprise, no one ridiculed me for thinking I saw Santa. Instead, they determined I was old enough to know the truth about the former owner of the farmhouse. He was a really old person, who was sadly found dead under suspicious circumstances. Turns out my uncle had plenty of odd occurrences throughout his time living there. Never anything hurtful or violent, but definitely his presence was known. What really sealed the deal was when they showed me a picture of the previous owner, Saul, and what do you know? He had a remarkable resemblance to Santa. When I was 6 years old, we moved next to my father's parents' house. Suddenly, my mum saw me talking to something that wasn't there. She didn't pay that much attention though, since she thought it was just the imaginary friend phase. After a few days, my friendship started to freak out my mum, and I started asking why my friend was always sad, and why he was allowed to stand next to the stove and I wasn't. She then tried to explain that he was just imaginary. "He lives under the sink," I said. My mum told me that I could tell her the exact location and emotions this boy had. She struggled to make me understand that he was not real, and she thought it was just a phase until my grandfather said he found a boy sitting at the backyard, which was a common area between my and my grandparents' house. He was sitting there in the middle of the night. When he asked if he was okay, the boy said he was waiting for his mum and he couldn't leave. My grandpa called his wife, and when she came out, the boy was gone. My grandparents said that whenever they went outside to take out the trash at night, they could see the boy sitting in the backyard, and then he'd just vanish. I'm a 36-year-old male, and I live near Atlanta. I'm married, and truthfully, life is pretty boring. I'm a former Navy, former law enforcement officer, and have a bachelor in mechanical engineering. I'm also a huge gamer and PC nerd, and haven't been religious since I was about 8. And when people ask him what I believe in, I simply reply, I believe in science, and leave it at that. There is another side of me that listens to Alan Watts' Chill Step at night, and ponder the deep questions of reality in our universe. But in most of the day-to-day situations I'm very logical, and usually try to debunk things first. But when logic and science cannot explain something that happens, that's when you really start to question everything. One of my earliest core memories I have is from when I was 4 years old in 1990. It was the ghost I saw when I was in my grandparents' house in Florida. I remember my mum sitting on the couch in the living room talking with both of them, and so I ran off the house to explore instead of listening to the grown-up talk, as interesting as it wasn't. There was a dividing wall that separated the living room where they were from another room that my grandparents called the den. It was used for other social visits when they hosted guests. I was in the back hallway of the house, peeking into the den around the doorframe from the hallway. As I'm peeking around the doorframe in, it's a long rectangular-shaped room with just blank white wall on the left and a row of curtained windows on the long right wall. Mind you, this is broad daylight on a sunny spring day, so there is a lot of ambient light coming in from the windows, and I'll never forget what I saw until the day I die. An old wrinkly lady in a Victorian-style dress floating in mid-air in the middle of the room. She was maybe 10 or 15 feet from me, floating about a foot off the ground, looking at the wall, so I was looking at the side of her. I'm not an artist, and I cannot draw to save my life, but the image is so clear in my mind I wish I could. Her dress was blue with frizzy lace around the wrists and neck. She had silver grey hair pulled back into a bun behind her head. She was translucent, so I could see her, but I could also see through her. There was a dining room table and about 6 wooden chairs behind her so that I could see through her. I also could not see her feet, just the bottom of her dress, as it was waved slightly in a very ethereal way and about a foot off the ground. She turned her head to the left and almost directly at me, which I actually don't remember scaring me at the time, then turned her head back to front, then looked upwards and kind of evaporated towards the ceiling and disappeared. That's the clearest memory I have in my entire brain, even more so than other core memories from that young age range. It's crystal clear in my mind's eye. We found out later that my grandfather had originally bought the house from an old man whose wife had died in the house, and he too was too old to keep up the land anymore. So we think maybe I saw her, but we're not really sure. We also realized later on that if not for that left wall being there, the one the lady was looking at, she would have been looking directly into the back of my mum's head. Like, if not for that wall being there, she was actually watching the three of them talk. I've had many other unexplainable experiences in my life, from living in a haunted apartment 10 feet from a graveyard and all kinds of crazy stuff that happened as well. In 2013, as a university student, I lived in an oldish tenement flat in Glasgow, Scotland, probably 200 to 250 years old, which is quite common over there. It was a dusty, cold flat with high ceilings, 4 bedrooms, which I had the biggest one. Things started normally enough, until one night after my flatmate's birthday party. We had used my room to host it, and someone had made a cake. We hadn't finished it and left it wrapped up in tinfoil on the table. As I was trying to sleep, I could hear the tinfoil rustling. I got up in case of a rat, but there was nothing, and I left the lamp on and tried to sleep. But I heard more rustling, so I sat up in bed and saw the tinfoil around the cake pop open. My heart pounding, I picked it up and put it in the kitchen. I was feeling a bit spooked, so I went back to bed to sleep. Over the next few days and weeks, I certainly noticed more bangs, but it was an old flat, so noisy pipes perhaps. Then one day me and my flatmate came home from uni. He was busting for the toilet, but it was locked. We banged on the door, but no one answered. Turned out it was locked from the inside, but there was no one in there. We had to phone the landlord to get permission to break the lock. They fixed it the next day, and the same thing happened 2 weeks later. Then one night I got up to use the toilet, and the shower was on full blast. I started thinking that something ghostly was going on. One of my flatmates, Adam, agreed, and the other two who studied sciences disagreed. Then one afternoon I was lying in bed on my back texting, and a £1 coin fell from what must have been the ceiling and bounced off my chest. It proper freaked me out, and I left the room. The next day, one fell again from what seemed to be the ceiling when I was in the shower. I told my flatmate, and the same thing happened to Lewis when he was sitting on his desk studying. Then it was quiet for a few weeks, until one night at 2 a.m. I heard a banging on my wall that woke me up. It was only me and Lewis in the flat. The other two had gone home for the holidays, and I went through to the hallway to see if there was anything causing the bangs, where I met Lewis, who'd also woken up. The kitchen door then slammed shut with such force we panicked, got a knife out each, and slept in the same bed with the light on. The next day we phoned a minister who said he didn't deal with that sort of stuff, but to burn sage and open all the windows. I have to say it worked. The flat felt less creepy, and nothing really happened after that. There was this one weekend where me and my family and some family friends went camping out in Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. There was this one house that's supposedly haunted, and may in fact be after you hear what happened. This haunted house was built in a tiny little farmhouse with a few rooms on the ground level, a few upstairs and an unfinished basement. We had just finished the tour and were given these stupid ghost sensors and were allowed to explore the entire house. So me and some friends grouped up with some people that we met there and started exploring. We go upstairs first, search all the rooms, even go into the attic, but there's nothing, absolutely nothing. So we finished upstairs and began heading downstairs. To get to the basement, you had to go outside and into a cellar-like door. So we get into the basement and found the tricycle that was explained to be haunted and apparently rolls around in the middle of the night. Nothing else, just a silly tricycle. We all kind of searched the room, as it was the only one room with a water heater in a corner, but found nothing. We all begin to just talk in the basement and make small chat. This is when the most unexplainable thing that I have ever experienced happened. We were all just kind of talking when suddenly we heard what sounded like change hitting the floor above us. Not like a handful of coins, but lots. A few moments of silence, and then bam, a huge bang out of nowhere occurs above us. Everyone screams and runs out of the room except for me and an older gentleman, who I presumed was the grandfather of the kids we met. We look at each other in confusion, and everyone proceeds upstairs where the room right above us was. The tour guide and several other people on the tour were in this room. Now mind you, this room was the exhibit room, where there were glass showcases and bookshelves. A loud bang could have knocked stuff over. We asked the tour guide, and the other people on the tour had heard change falling on the ground preceded by a loud bang. They told us they hadn't heard anything. To this day I have no clue what happened, causing me to believe that that house may in fact be haunted. Hey guys, thank you so much for coming. The ghosties will miss you, but we do hope to see you again soon. A huge thank you as always to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. For signing up, you get a bunch of bonus content like a cool exclusive Glitch in the Matrix video, which is only available on those platforms. Follow the links in the description if you'd like to find out more. But until then, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.